Well, generally speaking, when the shooting starts, the talking stops. And if the talking does start again where while the shooting is going on, it's beginning in a very different place. And conflict prevention is a lot easier than conflict resolution. So as soon as you start fighting, as soon as war begins, diplomacy becomes infinitely more difficult. So that would be my sort of point about the relationship, and why is it that if you're using hard power, it's prejudicial to the interests of soft power? Well, just look at Afghanistan. Why is it proving to be so difficult to get negotiations going when it couldn't be clearer that nobody's winning and the only way out is going to be a negotiated settlement? And yet, well, that's because when you're pumping in the soldiers and the money and the weapons and the counterinsurgency specialists, it's very difficult to start talking under those circumstances. How does guerrilla diplomacy address these issues? Well, guerrilla diplomacy could have been called a backpacker's guide to diplomacy. It takes a lot of those skills, and I was talking at some length to Dave's students about this. The life skills, the problem solving, the self-reliance, the self-sufficiency, the resilience, the ability to communicate cross-culturally, the language skills. This allows you to operate at the grassroots level. That's where we need diplomats to be effective these days. Wrote a long piece last year or the year before in the Hague Journal of Diplomacy about how the thinking in public diplomacy and ironically counterinsurgency is coming together around the idea that conflict in the 21st century is, because it's less and less between states and more in these asymmetrical situations where you have states versus various other actors, but they're not representing other states. All the old think about how you prosecute war has to be thrown out, and the same with how are you going to find a way to peace. So if you've got diplomats, for example, that have the wherewithal to be effective in conflict zones or in favelas or barrios or souks or in the storefront, where they're interacting with people, where they're mixing it up with locals, what your diplomat cannot be in the 21st century is seen to be flopping around like a fish out of water. Instead, they've got to be swimming like a fish in the sea of the people. They've got to be comfortable and at ease doing that. And that's why the backpacker skill set is going to serve the 21st century diplomat probably much more effectively than years and years and years spent in the finest Ivy League universities acquiring formal knowledge. Which isn't to say I've got any problem with formal knowledge. I think it's very important, even necessary, but not sufficient to do the kind of diplomacy we've got to do today.